Bobby, how you doing today?
Great. How are you, Ryan?
Good. I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on the show because as we were just chatting a little bit, your podcast interview that you did with John Warlow and Bo Burlingham's book sent me down this entire road with my company and this show. So the fact that you're on is awesome. And I think for the listeners, they'll be able to, you've got a very real story that you do a very good job explaining the ins and outs of it. But, for our listeners, can you kind of go back to the day that you first became an entrepreneur? Because it was First Research, the company that you started. But, when did you decide to become an entrepreneur and how did you jump in with both feet?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, relevant question for all entrepreneurs. But I have heard that, it's like people become entrepreneurs for a few different reasons. And I think the one that's maybe overlooked a good bit is that certain people become entrepreneurs, not so much for business reasons, but for psychological reasons. And that, they sort of don't fit in with society very well. They don't fit really well into structures. And they're not really the retiring type who say, oh, well, I'm just going to go live in the woods. But they're just not going to fit into systems. And I worked for a bank in the 1990s, and I was a calling officer. And it became Bank of America, actually. It was Nations Bank. But I knew, my original goal when I first signed up to go work there out of college was I was going to be CEO. Just for my driven personality. Mm-hmm. I said, that would be so cool. But as a few years went by, it became more and more obvious that wasn't going to happen. A lot of the things that frustrated me so much was the inability for me to do things myself when I see something that would be a great idea that I couldn't actually go make that happen. Yeah. The other thing is just the contradictions. There were so many contradictions in the business that are just naturally there. It just drove me psychologically crazy.
I love it.
And my plan was actually to ride my bike across the country. And my now wife, had been dating for a few years. She asked me, tell me big picture, what's going on or whatever with us. And all I talked about was wanting to ride my bike across the country and quit my job, but I never included her in the plan. So she dumped me. So it took me 2 years to get her back. But actually, that was sort of that time frame around 97, 98 was the time frame. I knew I wanted to start my own business. And I was like, wow, it's so cool that that's actually an option to start my own company. And I had 4 or 5 different ideas. Like a lot of entrepreneurs, you have way more ideas than actual time. But I chose the industry research one, which was, and guess what? The reason I chose it is because I was so frustrated working at the bank because they wouldn't implement my idea of providing call prep sheets to all the loan officers. And so I was like so frustrated, I started it. So it's still my story.
Well, and I'm assuming your wife was involved in that vision.
Well, no, because she dumped me right before I started it.
So you started the company right after you started, or right after that whole situation? Yeah,
I guess she waited to make sure it was going to work out okay before she came back. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding, man. No, we didn't get back together until a year or two after I started First Research.
Well, and I think, the origination of the business, and you hit on a lot of different things. The origination of the business comes out of frustration or some need, and, us as entrepreneurs having a difficult time fitting into the framework. I think you hit the nail on the head because it is so psychological. And I think that's why I love your story so much, because you grew a very successful company. And if you want to just, before, as we kind of go through the different steps of the journey, Bobby, can you kind of explain the company and how you were growing? Because it ties into the book that you wrote, Hockey Six Principles, but kind of explain the business journey as you were growing and some of the major milestones.
Yeah, sure. First, I'll tell you what we do, what First Research does. We provide, or First Research, I should say, since I sold it in 2007, provides industry profiles from the perspective of a sales and marketing individual. So if you're a salesperson and you're selling to multiple industries and you would love to be like a specialist and only concentrate on one particular industry, when I say industry, I mean pretty specific, like convenience stores or funeral homes or furniture stores, then you can use our industry profiles and read them, and they're 20 pages or so, And then because of how we organize the information, the type of information we have, you can walk in and meet with a business owner or executive, and that person will say, wow, you sure do know a lot about furniture. That gives that particular salesperson a huge leg up. Mm-hmm. That's what we did. And so that was my idea. And the way the idea came up was that I was, like I said, a calling officer. And I would go meet with all these different types of businesses. And I'll never forget, we were with one of our customers, and the guy was Queensboro Steel Company in Wilmington, North Carolina. And the CEO was this guy named Mark, and he was in the front seat, and I was in the back seat. And I remember where we were on 4th Street in Wilmington. My boss asked Mark what made this guy named Sam Catlett such a good calling officer from BB&T Bank. And the response was, Mark said, well, because Sam was a really good banker. And he said, well, he's smart. He asked good questions. And then he paused and he said, and he knows a lot about steel. And I thought, wow, that's what I'm going to do. Because I was 25 years old. I'm like, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I went hog wild with it. And it worked so well. Then I started forming these cheat sheets on all these industries, 10 or 15 of them. And I noticed the other loan officers around me wanted access to them. But we had an industry research department. And so the way you were supposed to get information was fill out a form, fax it in a week in advance, they'd mail you all this stuff. And I thought, well, that's efficient if you're trying to do an in-depth report, but if you just want to be ready to roll, that's inefficient. So I went to them and I said, you should take my little cheat sheets and put them up on the intranet. And they didn't want to do it. And it made me furious. And so I looked for a partner. I knew I needed a partner. And that took me about a year. And I think I was very inefficient in that process. I was going to big companies like Dun & Bradstreet, who ended up buying us, and Frost & Sullivan, and a bunch of the big research companies, and thinking they would partner with me. And they wouldn't partner with an individual. I know that now, but I didn't then. So I ended up finding this individual named Ingo Windsor. And he told me, he said, I'll write the first 30 industry profiles if you give me 30% of the company. That was kind of our business deal. And he says, I don't know how to sell, but I know how to do great research. And boy, did he ever. He was a phenomenal researcher. And so Ingo and I teamed up, and that's how we got started in 1999. And the first year, I started selling in March. And by the end of that year, 99, I'd only sold $4,000 worth of subscriptions. I thought it was the best idea ever, but it just got off to a slow start, which is, one of the premises in my book. It just takes forever. So that's kind of the genesis.
Well, and I think that's a good dovetail into your actual business model, because, in the show, we're talking a lot about business value, where you're creating it and how you end up potentially transitioning in it. But your book, you talk about the slow, steady figuring out of the business model for the first few years. So as you were figuring that out, $4,000, you obviously knew you were onto something to keep at it. How are you trying to figure out your business model? How did you go to market, and how did you price the services?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say I did a lot of things I was very naive. And so I did a lot of things at the beginning that weren't so bright. But one thing I did do that was pretty smart was the business model I established. And that was in 1999. I don't believe there were hardly any SaaS business models around, software as a service, or at least I didn't know about it. But I decided to price First Research according to an annual fee. So depending on how many people you had at that institution, that would be how much your annual fee was. Now, I started out, basically I did this, basically projection. And I showed all these banks because I figured I'd go sell to all these banks, and they would just pour in. And they were, it was like the typical bank would maybe pay us, say, $10,000 or $15,000 a year for 50 loan officers, that type of thing. Maybe $100, $200, $300 per loan officer per year. So it wasn't expensive. I tried to price it like a Wall Street Journal subscription, or a little bit cheaper per person. And but I miscalculated. I figured I could just mail the profile to the banks and they would eat it up, but I didn't position my product well. So I was out there saying I can sell you a bunch of research and it's going to make your bankers smarter, when really I should have been positioning First Research to the banks as I could become an internal advocate for pre-call preparation. And I could become, and then I had to kind of sell myself to get those first subscriptions. And I think that's true of a lot of new businesses. You think you have this great product when really at the beginning you have kind of an early adopter type product, which is sort of incomplete. Therefore, you have to sell yourself as a consultant with your product a lot of times, which is kind of how I hacked my way through it.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Trust me, it's a great product and service.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, how did you, as you were figuring out the software as a service business model and the annual subscriptions, did you have any pushback as you were repackaging how people were buying services like that?
Well, it's not that they said no when I would pitch it to them. It's that they didn't quite know what to do with it. And so they would not say no and not fully say yes. Most of them would show me a lot of enthusiasm. And that's what I call good meeting syndrome. And I think good meeting syndrome throws off more, startup, new idea entrepreneurs than anything, because people don't want to really let you down and they want to see the positives of something. So what they do is they give you this really good meeting, but then when you ask them to actually take action and sign a contract or roll it out or send you money, that's where they pause, and they will pause for months. And that's what happened to me is I just had a lot of good meetings and never could close anybody. I mean, I finally closed like one of my first customers was actually a CPA firm, not a bank. And they became my lifeblood, the CPA firms, because they were a little more nimble. They were a little more entrepreneurial. There was less structure. But I ran into some guy on the street in Wilmington, down on the coast in North Carolina, and he's a CPA, and he asked me what I was doing. And he asked me if I had anything on food manufacturers or food distributors. And I'm like, no, but I can get you one. He's fast. We wrote that profile in no time. And he loved it. And he bought a subscription for like $500 a year. And then he ended up referring me to a trade association. And that's kind of how I got started, because the banks took forever.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And with your crazy growth too, can you explain some of the milestones? Because as you were figuring out the first year or two, then you ended up clipping away at a very high pace. Can you kind of give us a little bit of benchmarks of how fast you were growing?
Yeah. So the first year, 1999, I did 4,000. The second year, 2000, I did 256,000 in revenue. Now, keep in mind, I had no renewals, so that was real, a book of business. So I sold that much. Now, the smartest thing I ever did was I think it was January or February of 2000. So I didn't have a lot of money at all, but I knew this guy named Will Brawley, who was a really good salesman at the bank, and he was very young, very charismatic. And I really wanted him to join us. And I cut a deal with him, and I had to pay him like $4,000 a month plus commission. And I hadn't paid myself in a year, almost a year. And I went ahead and took that first little bit of money and paid Will. And now we had two people selling like crazy. And so the next year in 2001, I think it was $780,000 worth of business. So really what I did is I think I probably renewed the 250,000, sold 500,000 more worth. So we were pretty rolling from there. And then of course the snowball effect after that. But the smartest thing I ever did, like I said, was hire Will when I was really, I was not very conservative with that, but it worked out well. I'll say that.
I was going to say a lot of entrepreneurs always have a challenge as trying to replicate themselves and being able to have someone else sell for them as well, because they're looking to put bread on the table. So that was a big decision to make.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I was able to do that is, like I said, I was single at that time, no kids, my personal overhead was $2,250 a month. I mean, that's all the money I needed, and I couldn't wait tables and make that money, even back then. And that was my plan, back of the napkin plan. But at the time, I was living off of savings, and I didn't have a lot of savings at all. I cashed out my stock option plan to kind of get the thing started, and I spent most of that on technology and getting things built out. And then the rest of the money I had like 30 or 40,000 in stocks. and I took one of those loans against the stocks, so I didn't, and I was living off of that. But anyway, I tell people, like, when's the right age to start a company? And there is no perfect age, or that's a very individual situation or question. But I think that 20 something is a fantastic time if you don't have a lot of personal overhead, because the biggest overhead expense oftentimes is just getting the founders paid. And we just didn't have that problem. I was able to invest so much. The other thing about Vertical IQ is we got paid up front. First Research. Vertical IQ is my existing business that does the same thing. But we get paid up front. And so it's like if I sign a subscription for $10,000 for a year, then they pay us the check for $10,000 up front. It was a wonderful financing.
Well, was that premeditated too? Because, when we think about, John Warlow's got the value builder system, and there's, a lot of value building methodologies out there, and it's get paid first and build a subscription model. With those two things that you did, you nailed. Was it premeditated, or was it out of necessity, or how did you come to that model?
I think it was both luck and skill. It was luck because I didn't do it consciously. Like, I didn't read some book and go, this is clever, this is smart, this is what I'm going to do. But I think it was skill because I had been a banker, and bankers, it's a pretty good job for a young person because you meet with a ton of business owners. And I had a lot of financial savvy from being a banker, especially a business banker, a fair amount. So I understood very well the value of cash and the whole cash is king thing. And I knew that I figured that I would go broke if they didn't pay me up front.
Yeah.
I would have thought I was true, but I never even considered raising capital, right? So I was accurate in that. But that's kind of how I came up with that, getting paid up front. So
then, when you sold, Bobby, because that was, you loved being an entrepreneur, and can you kind of just walk us through, like, what was a triggering event? If you loved being an entrepreneur so much and you started to realize it was in your psychological nature to enjoy it, what led you to sell?
Well, that's a great question. It's a very important question because what happened with my situation is it kind of snuck up on me. In other words, like, I wasn't looking to sell First Research. I had no desire or plans to sell the business. It was not one of my strategies per se. In fact, I looked at it sort of humbly, which was accurate. No one would want our little business anyway. It's a niche. It's not going to go to $1 billion. It's not even going to go to 100 million. And it's just a really cool business. Now, granted, we had like 6 or 7 million in revenue and growing fast. It is a $50 or $100 million market, I guess you could say. But what happened is that Dun & Bradstreet was in the process of building out profitable internet businesses, and they had purchased Hoover's, which is a information database for sales and marketing professionals, but primarily about companies. And then they had purchased another company that provides information about people. And so it made sense that they fill out that with industries. And I was at a trade show, actually, and a lady in business development from Hoover's. Now she doesn't even do mergers and acquisitions. She was literally like partnerships, like sales. And she looked at our product and our business and said, just, in 3 minutes at our trade show booth, and told me, she goes, we should buy you. And about 3 weeks later, some of their, mergers and acquisitions people at D&B called us to start conversations about possible ways to work together, and quite frankly, I was very confident. I told them a few times I didn't really want to sell the business, which was true. But, they asked all the right questions. Well, if you did want to sell the business, what would you sell it for?
So how did you start going, because, getting blindsided with the out of the blue offer, I think happens a lot. And so how did that, as you're, grinding the business, growing the business, how did you deal with it mentally? How did you start processing what she had said or the conversations that were going? Did you start thinking about what was the dialogue in your head?
Well, that's just it, is that, at the time in 2006, I was really I would say excited and confident. We were doing a ton of business. The business was fun and exciting, and we had about 50 people. I was loving it. So I wasn't overthinking anything. I was quote unquote living the dream. Now, what happened is that our people were talking to their people, and then the president of Hoover's wanted to fly in and meet with us along with some people from D&B. And then I was in those meetings, and we were talking about strategic ways we could partner, selling each other's products, combining products. And I was looking primarily for a sales channel, vice versa. But the president of Hoover's wanted me to drive him to the airport. He's like, "You mind driving me to the airport? I'd love to catch up with you one-on-one." I knew that. I felt like he was probably going to ask me about something else, but that's when he said, "It probably makes more sense to just combine the companies. All this sounds sort of complex." And he explained the fact that primarily company research at D&B for Hoover's was done in Austin, Texas. People were done in Ohio, and then Raleigh could be the hub for industries, and that he could see us growing really fast if we combined, and that First Research would become this big, amazing thing. So I was like, "Yeah, that's interesting." But I was like, but unfortunately, I don't, you're right. Yeah, but I don't really want to.
Yeah.
Right. And then they asked me, they said, like a couple of weeks later, they're very patient. Or they called me and they said, the people from D&B asked, "What do you think the company's worth?" And I was like, 30 million or something. And they were like, "Well, we think it's worth, 12 million. I was like, "Well, then let's just not mess with it." But they, to their credit, they waited about 3 months. Like, they didn't call me at all. And I was like, I didn't care. I didn't want to sell. So I didn't care. And then they called me back and said, "Well, how did you do? How were your numbers? Did you actually hit those numbers?" I'm like, "Of course we did, man." So one thing led to another, and we ended up selling the business.
So, one thing led to, it's so funny because there's so much in between there, isn't there? Like, when you decided, so you gave them the number for 30 million. How did you come up with that? Was that a number that you had determined when you left the bank, and that was what you wanted in the bank account? Was that just like some arbitrary number? Like, how did you get to that? And then why did you eventually end up agreeing to selling?
Well, no, the 30 million was arbitrary in the sense that, obviously we benchmarked it to our revenue and benchmarked it to our profits and that kind of thing. We were a profitable business. But it was, I think Ingo's older than me. I was 30, yes. What was my age? 37 or so? Ingo was, I don't remember what Ingo was, but maybe 57. And I had his interest in mind too, because, he owned at the time about 27% of the business or 30% or something. And Ingo was very open to that number. And I was like, well, if it's good for everybody else. And of course, a lot of the employees, they had options, stock options. And so some of the executives that knew we were in talks, most people didn't, but some people had to know we were in talks. They were like, "Yeah, I wouldn't mind a couple $100,000,
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe this is, and then I looked at the number too, and I was like, well, I could do anything, or it just opens up all kinds of things. Now, keep in mind, the whole idea was to grow. I thought it would be best for the business as well. And in some ways it was best for the business, but that was also a big factor, is what's best for the business type of thing.
Well, and yeah. What is best for the business and your vision? Because you obviously did you have a vision of what you wanted First Research to be? And was there, like, you saw some reality into that part, or that merger? Like, what in your head, what did you want First Research to be?
Well, we were making the information more and more tailored, more and more helpful. We knew that the information about industries standing alone by itself was only so useful to a busy salesperson. They really want company information right next to it, or like people information right next to it. And so we knew that was some direction that we wanted to go in some form or fashion, right? And it was either through partnerships. It was probably through partnerships, not through build. You're not going to go build 3 million records unless I mean, we didn't rule it out. We didn't rule anything out, or even 10 million records. But a combination made the most sense to get that information together. So part of it was very strategic in that way.
Yep.
You know.
So then,
2020, but yeah.
Oh, right. No, I mean that makes a ton of sense, and it on paper, it makes all the partnerships seem like it's a match in heaven. So then how did you back into the 30 million? Because I mean, you got a multiple in revenue, if I'm correct, right? Versus a multiple at EBITDA. And how did you determine what it was worth? Was it a strategic number that you were trying to figure out whether they were going to build it and that's how much it would have cost? Or was it like just actually cash flow and projections? Or how did you get to that number?
Well, so we ended up selling for $22.5 million plus a $4 million earnout. So is that 26.5? And I was very confident we could hit the earnout and would hit the earnout, and we did. And so I think that we definitely looked at mathematical models. I shouldn't say mathematical, just financial models. Know what our business was worth. $6.5 million in sales, going to 10 million, X operating margins. And then you look at benchmarks and you go, well, this company over here sold for this much. This company sold for that much. Now, what we didn't do, which was a really big decision, Ryan, was should we hire a quote unquote broker and let other companies look at us as well, right? Because usually when a company gets sold, they put together a package and get a broker and sell it. And that broker says, well, if D&B is willing to pay that much, I'll bet you another company out there is willing to pay more, and you drive up the price. But we decided not to do that because they were very motivated and they wanted to close by a certain date, which is pretty fast. And I didn't really want to fool with it, to tell you the truth. I didn't want to go around the country and go, hey, we're for sale. You want to buy us? And then meet with all these people and go through the stress. And so I did.
Do you regret doing that or not doing that?
No, I regret not reading Bo's book.
Right.
I think if I'd read Bo's book, Bo Burlingham's book, Finish Big, or is it Finish Big or Finishing Big? Yeah.
Finish Big, yep.
Yeah, I think I would have been way better off. But I don't regret shopping it around. I don't think that would have helped us that much. We might have gotten a few million more, but nah.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I loved your interview with John, and why I'm, if we can, unravel why you wish you would have read Bo's book, I think, Bobby, is huge, because it's, think about the name of the podcast. It's Life After Business and knowing what you're going to be doing afterwards and why. And, what is it that tell us about your experience about closing and then afterwards, and then why you wish you would have read Bo's book.
Well, okay, I'll start with Bo's book because I think Finish Big does a great job of enabling any entrepreneur to think through the process of the end, hence the word finish. Now, it does end differently. Even if you sell, you don't always end your CEO or president, founder or whatever. I mean, there are plenty of stories of successful exits that Bo talks about, but there are plenty of stories of sort of like, I probably would have done that differently had I known then what I know now. But I think that Bo's book does a good job of looking at the sale from many different perspectives. And I didn't have enough of those perspectives, like the perspective of the buyer, the perspective of the employees, the perspective of your own self-worth, and like what makes you tick without you even knowing it, like your own brand or your own shtick. Shtick's probably the best word for it. and then from the perspective of what's next, right? Like if you sell, what happens next? Really thinking through that carefully, as opposed to just selling on a whim, because, doing things on a whim had worked very well for me, right? Like that's how I rolled. That's how I started First Research, was sort of on a whim. I'm going to do this. Screw it. Let's do it. Very Richard Branson-like. And frankly, a lot of my ideas at First Research were screw it, let's do it. It worked very well. But unfortunately, a sale is a much more strategic, and it's much larger ramifications with more pieces of the puzzle and more tentacles that Bo was able to bring out in that book.
Right.
I hope that makes sense. But what were the second parts of your question?
Well, no, I think that it's all intertwined to this because there's so much to the book. And, Bobby, when you sold, you had, when you say what's afterwards, you were probably ingrained in your identity in the business and the people and what you were trying to accomplish. I mean, explain that emotional process of when you sold and what happened to your company afterwards.
Yeah, first of all, big picture, there are three things that Bo points out that can happen when you sell your business, generally speaking. Number two, your business. Number one, your business can remain a company, meaning it has its own profit and loss statements, it has its own divisions. I mean, it has its own departments, has its own employees that do turnkey, take care of that product. That's outcome number one. Number two, you can become a division. And a division, of course, is when you had some shared services like, well, no sense in having your own accounting finance department. That's just operational. We'll take care of that. Oh, okay. When you have marketing, we have marketing. Why would you hire all these people for marketing? We'll just do the marketing for you in conjunction with what we're doing. Or we have salespeople too, and we'll just have our salespeople say, would you like fries with that? And so that's kind of a division. You sort of pick and choose throughout the organization on what stays with the product versus what goes to the larger headquarters or whatever. The last option is you can become a product. And when you become a product, you really just have a product manager. Now, granted, you have someone people who take care of the product and write software for the code, do the industry research. But the company has now become a product where there are no salespeople or marketing people, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the three things that can happen to you when you sell a business. And, I didn't see that really coming. I was always under the impression we were going to remain a company through the general comments that were made all along. But turns out we were a better fit probably as a product. And so what happened to our company was we became a product. And over time, most employees were either laid off or left the company, And so the company per se was no more. It was just a product.
So how did you deal with that when you were watching these people kind of flounder around like fish out of water at D&B? I mean, did you feel responsible for it? Did you have regrets on how it went, or what would you have done differently?
Yes. It was brutal, man. I mean, I completely miscalculated how hard it would be. I mean, I was visiting with psychologists weekly. I was under so much stress. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. So I ended up having a stress test at the doctor. They put all these cords all over you and make you get on a treadmill to see if you're healthy. I mean, is he going to die? Type of thing. And, but I had physical pain. I wasn't sleeping well. And, everybody was very stressed out. And a lot of people were turning to me for answers. And as much as I wanted to give them answers, it became clearer and clearer that I knew a little more than them, but I didn't know the answer. So I would do the best I could with information within reason, but I just didn't have the answer. So, I mean, I'll never forget it. They were going to roll out this sales thing where how do we sell first research type of thing. And I thought I was like one of the people who are really creating this go-to-market thing, sort of a communication, if you will, across the franchise on how first research would be sold. And I was like, I got this. I got it under control. Don't worry. And then I found out that it already went out. I was like, I'm working on it now with executives, and we had this. And then a few of the salespeople were together like, Bobby, it's already gone out. It's in our inbox. And I'm like, well, I didn't even get it. So it's brutal, man. It's really tough.
So
and it's how it goes, man.
Well, what did you think what was the biggest, I mean, maybe you haven't even articulated it, but where did you struggle the most? Was it the lack of control or the lack of, creativity that you were able to, what was it that you actually struggled with, or loyalty? Or, do you know exactly what couple things you think it was?
Well, it's a great question. I struggle with all things like that. So I've struggled with the lack of control. I remember we had a business plan that under the merger, we were supposed to follow, and that involved hiring a bunch of people. But when I hired a few people soon after the merger, I got chastised by HR because I wasn't supposed to hire anybody without going through this process. And then finally, I wasn't allowed to hire anybody. But the point is that I didn't have any control over anything really within reason. Like I just didn't. And that's just, I didn't see that coming. You know what I mean? I just didn't calculate for it. And certainly the other big thing is that they keep score differently. And so like First Research would quote unquote keep score a certain way. So like a salesperson at First Research would be measured on his or her success over an annual basis. But then at a large company, they're usually measured success over a weekly basis or a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. And so the measurements were much shorter, right? And so I was like, if I missed a week, like let's say that First Research didn't hit its target for a week, I never thought anything of that. I always measured the business per year. Mm-hmm. Like committed to saying, or if we committed to ourselves that we would sell $3 million in new subscriptions in a year or something, then in a year we would sell $3 million. But what we didn't commit to is $3 million divided by 52, or I didn't know anything about that. Mm-hmm. Because our sales fluctuate week to week too much. And so that was absolutely brutal as I was like, oh, how are we going to generate, another 100,000 this week? We can't. And then they would say, you've got to. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is new. This is different. I'm not used to this.
So how did you go about dealing with it mentally? As you were starting to realize this and it's coming to, your awareness. I mean, how did you deal with it as you were working for D&B? And how did you, what did you find out was missing and how did you end up overcoming it?
Well, I had to work there until June 30th, 2018, like a year and 2 months. That's the only way I could really overcome it, was just not work there anymore, right? Because it was so different than what I was used to and so different than what I was comfortable with. Now, keep in mind, that's a good company. Like D&B, they didn't do anything wrong. They were great. They're really good businessmen and women. They know what they're doing. I don't want to imply that they were bad and I was good. All I'm saying is I'm only telling you how I felt, right? So their strategy was probably sound and good, but the only way to overcome it was to not work there anymore. I would have liked to have left earlier, and I sort of became a salesperson. I kind of got phased out of that role as president, which was okay. I mean, I didn't have bitterness over that. So I was kind of selling First Research and portions of the West Coast. Mm-hmm. I was going to Portland and Seattle, which was cool. I kind of like that.
So, what would you have done differently now that hindsight 2020? I mean, what would you have done differently throughout the entire process?
Well, first of all, that's another, man, you ask great questions, man. I think that, honestly, man, if I was going to sell to D&B, now that I know what I know now, that I would do it, I would be much savvier in knowing what to expect. And I would go, okay, this is what we can expect. My job is to help the company I sold to execute to the best of their ability, to the best of my ability, so that they can be as successful as possible. Don't get me wrong. I did not execute, but I just feel like if I had known then, I could have taken all the emotion out of it and gone, that's what we signed up for. And, I gave a lot of the employees a fair amount of money, even more than the options, but I would probably do even more now. Knowing then, I would probably say, all right, that's not enough options. You deserve more cash. So I would take more money out of my pocket and give it to the people who had to do a career change. Now, they all landed on 2 feet. One of the greatest things that came of it was that a bunch of new businesses started of ex and First Research employees, really successful ones. There's this one company you should interview called Schedule Fly.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely fascinating guys if you can pin them down, but they are really off the curve in a good way. And it's employee scheduling. But three key people from First Research started Schedule Fly. I started Vertical IQ, which is really jamming. It's kind of industry profiles for primarily for bankers and CPAs. And then Carolyn and Ingo, they started Local Market Monitor, which is jamming, and the list goes on and on.
So did any, obviously all of your employees are pretty solid individuals. Did any of them hold it against you, or did they just like mentally and financially and career wise all land on their feet without much of a hiccup?
I would say they didn't land without a hiccup, but I don't think they held it against me. No, there was a couple of them who were rumbling, who were angry, but most people, I mean, almost all of them were totally cool about it, to tell you the truth. I mean, they didn't blame me at all. And even though I said I kind of screwed up, they still didn't blame me. They were like, man, you did what I would have done. You know, they were great. And no hard feelings. There's the other companies, Boardroom Insiders, that sprung out too. Lee Denby. That's a fantastic business. And all of them would make great interviews. You could get their perspectives on this merger too. Same merger.
And I think that it's a good tie into like, you know, what you're doing now. And so, you know, because you can tell the passion, enthusiasm, what you've got now. And I know there's been some time that's lapsed, but so let's maybe back up one sec before we talk about all these amazing businesses that you're involved in. And you know, Bobby, when you left D&B and had to recalibrate yourself in the 6 inches between your ears and understand who you are, what are the different resources or things that helped you go through that process, and how did you come out to where you are today?
Yeah, you know, the resources piece, I think counseling is really important, kind of a combination of psychological counseling coupled with career counseling. I ended up finding a guy who I really liked a lot, but it took me 3 or 4 years after I'd sold. So I wish I had met this guy, John, earlier, because it really is a process to think through sort of what's next. You know, this company was sold 10 years ago, which is crazy. And I think I also learned a good bit about the last 10 years. Like, what would I have done differently from the last 10 years? And it was interesting because I ended up writing the hockey stick principles, which was a absolutely blast project. I loved it. And so I learned a ton. It was like an MBA times 10. Primarily the interviews I did with successful founders was really interesting. I learned a ton. But I became an angel investor, which is a formula. I mean, a lot of people do that. But I've really enjoyed the way I've gone about it, which is I've invested in 8 companies and in a very like early stage, laid back way. So I don't have so much formality, and that's made it really fun. And quite frankly, a lot of them are successful life growth businesses where they're like, you know, millions in revenue, but they're not going to get to 100 million, yet they have good operating margins type of businesses. Mm-hmm. And they have niches. And that's been a really cool journey that I've loved, because now I'm basically buddies with 8 different founders of 8 different types of businesses, which is so And then Vertical IQ, of course, is sort of the second version of First Research, which has been a blast. We have 16 employees, and it's a really fun business. It's doing really well. So
as you're looking at these businesses, Bobby, you know, how are you approaching your investments or your emotional tie and relationships to these businesses and your new business differently because of what you went through with First Research?
Well, yeah, I'd see. I kind of emphasize to them to really think through what it is they're trying to build. Like, what is this you're really trying to do? About half of them are looking for the fast growth and the exit, right? They're looking for the sellout. However, it seems to be more of an explosive, like, let's scream on the scene, let's gather up some professional money, and let's get some really smart people and build something and then maybe sell it. I felt like First Research was more of a cult culture. You know, we were like, just sort of family. Just all these businesses are kind of family like that. You know what I mean? Like not all of them, but a lot of them have that vibe. But like people didn't really quit at First Research. We didn't have a lot of turnover. Like, I don't think anybody ever quit there. It was just because we were having fun and just sort of, it's like summer camp kind of thing. But it wasn't lazy either, you know. But we worked 40 hours a week, right? Like we were 40-hour work week people. So my advice to the founders I work with is like, I don't know, you sure you want to sign up for the 70-hour, kill yourself, and then sell out, and then have only 20% of your company when you sell out, and then make $2 million, then it gets taxed down to like $1.5 million. Like, what is that? Like, it doesn't seem like a great deal to me. I'd rather have a business that earns $300,000 or $400,000, $500,000 a year, and it's really just cool. And I work 40 hours a week, right? And so I'm always encouraging people to make their business whatever they want them to. Too many founders of new idea, tech startups, that kind of thing, think the formula is build it fast, grow it fast, pour capital into it, and then sell it. When really, a lot of these businesses should just be, how do I create a business that lasts for a very long time? It has 10 million in revenue, 25% operating margins, 20% growth with a phenomenal culture. Shouldn't that be the goal? Like, and that's kind of what we're doing with First Research. We could grow, Vertical IQ. We could grow Vertical IQ much faster, but we're just trying to enjoy the ride. You know?
Have you read book Small Giants?
Oh yes. That's Bo's other book.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's like to the T. What he is talking about in that book about building a small giant where you don't have to grow scale and, you know, take on VC money and all this other stuff. It's about building a healthy, sustainable business with good culture. And Poppy is crazy. I asked him this question and I said, can you finish big and become a small giant? And because it's about, and I don't know if you've got any advice from all the different companies you're working with or the people you've interviewed, but can you finish big and keep the company that carries on without you while having this kick-ass family culture business? You know, how do you balance that emotions, culture, financial return all at the same time? And I don't know if you've found a way to do it or if it's always a struggle.
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I do think you can do it for sure. I think certain situations make that happen more naturally. For example, if you get venture capital money and that VC money is professional money, your chances are much lower because they really need to sell and they need it to look like other businesses. They don't want you to do things that are a little off the curve just because you feel like it and it's your culture. They're looking for growth and they're looking for an exit. So if you take VC, it's hard to do. But you can do it, but it's more difficult. I also think that the way to get that done is if you're going to sell in the future, that try to sell over a 3 to 5 year period to the perfect partner and really understand who you're selling to, what their intentions for your business are in terms of integration and culture change and that kind of thing. Because it's absolutely doable, but you know, I just think that the other thing too is you want to put yourself in a position to have whatever you want in terms of a culture by having a business model that's profitable, right? So if you have good margins in your business and you can earn 10 to 20% operating margins out of your business every year, and you can still grow 20 to 30% a year, then you have the right business model. You know, they have that SaaS businesses have that rule of 40, like the growth rate plus the operating margin should be 40. So if you can hit the 40 rule, then you can do it, you know. But those are a couple of comments about that. No,
I think it's good advice because it takes time to get your head wrapped around what it is that you want. Because it takes because if you don't know what's out there, then it's hard to figure out what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think thinking through that carefully and slowly is the way to go. And you know, build the company the way you want it to be treated. Like build it the way you want it to make it. If you want it to be some, like, for example, like little things within the culture. Like if you want people to be able to work from home whenever they want, fine, do that. If you want to have a cool office too, then you can do that. You can do anything you want so long you make it work within reason. I mean, some of the guys I know, they've started businesses that are so good that they have unbelievable profit margins, and they have no cost in their business with millions in revenue, and they don't work. That's how talented they are. Now, granted, they created it that way. So everything they did, they went about it that way. And the biggest thing they are good at is saying no. So the ability to say no is oftentimes one big yes, right? And so you just set up the right business model and you can do anything. So,
well, and I think it's important too, because you build it. You just define what it is, finishing big while creating a small giant, because you've built something that's sustainable without you, and you've built something that you like. And, even that working from home, and there's this other lady who I've talked to where she had all these amazing things in her culture that were important to her, but she didn't choose the right partner. So if you sell to someone that doesn't allow your employees to work from home and destroys your culture, then you're going to be unhappy, even though you financially crushed it. Then don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. The partner, I tell you, I also think in my book, The Hockey Stick Principles, I'm like, avoid 50-50 partnerships. And it's a simple formula. Own 51% or more of your company. Otherwise you pretty much work for the other founders, or other founder. And that's not a bad thing, but it's a lot better if you have a particular goal in mind to build it the way you want to build it within reason. Now, you have to. A big part of building it the way you want to build it is keeping everybody's interests in mind, right?
Right. Well, Bobby, as we're wrapping up here, I don't know if there's any, you had a lot of great pieces of wisdom throughout the episode. Is there anything you want to highlight or leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I hope people take away from my chat with you, Ryan, is that, selling out is overrated. So if you sell out, you sell your company, that's oftentimes overrated, because having lots of money is overrated. And usually when you sell, it's a financial transaction normally. And having lots of money is mo money, mo problems. And that's for real. Notorious B.I.G. was right about just a bunch of headaches. But again, if you have a great business, you still are able to earn a really good profit and provide a ton of jobs or whatever. But having a lot of money and selling out is overrated. But having your own company with your own culture, running it the way you want to run it, it's great to employees and has good margins and is really great to its customers. That's underrated, right? And so that's kind of how I look at it. So I hope people picked up that from my chat with you.
Well, I enjoyed having you on the show so much. If the listeners want to get in touch with you or check out where you're at online, what would be the best place?
BobbyMartin.me, and it's BobbyMartin.me. It's also hockeystickprinciples.com, but I just go to BobbyMartin.me, and you can sign up for my blog. You can get in touch with me there, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Bobby.
Yeah, I loved it. Hey, Ryan, nice to meet you.